Welcome to City and State TV. I'm Executive Editor Michael Johnson. I'm joined today by Shola Olatoye, the Chair and CEO of NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me,
And you guys
Michael.
have some exciting news. You have the Next Generation NYCHA program that you've rolled out some more details about today. Before we talk about those specific details, tell us about the process, because I know it was very ground up. You went to a lot of the developments to get gauge the sentiment on the ground from the residents to get their feedback before coming together with this plan.
So, well, first of all, it's a really exciting time, I think, for the Housing Authority and for the city. When the mayor appointed me a little over 14 months ago, he was very clear with sort of two directives. One was to reset a series of relationships with, namely our residents, but also community partners, elected officials, et cetera. Two was to develop a sustainable plan for the Housing Authority so that we can ensure that we're around for another generation. And so thus we began the process that is Next Generation NYCHA, as well as the development of the plan. And so I've literally had the pleasure of meeting with and talking to hundreds of residents, thousands of employees across the city through a series of meetings. I've visited more than 90 developments and a number of town hall meetings, teas in people's kitchens, and more formal settings to really understand the challenge that's before us, but also what are some of the solutions that we should be really thinking and pushing forward. And what resonated with me and all of those conversations were sort of three key components: safe, clean, and connected. That's what everyone wants, whether you live in public housing or not. And so we embarked on a process to identify what are some specific strategies that help us achieve that vision. Next Generation NYCHA is not an A to Z plan, and it's not a kitchen sink plan of every single initiative we should be doing. These are strategic priorities that ultimately fundamentally change the operating model that is public housing, the funding model that is public housing, and how we look, and how we ensure that we're around for another generation of working New Yorkers.
Great, so let's get into the specifics a little bit. I mean, obviously, whenever you talk about NYCHA, you talk about funding. So how does Next Gen change, I guess, the funding model, or how does that approach, how does this now change how we go about funding NYCHA for the years to come, separate from, I guess, the one-shots you're kind of getting from the federal and the state government?
So we do this because we're at a critical point in our history. This is our 81st year. Public housing across the country has seen a precipitous decline in funding from the federal government. NYCHA has felt that even more so as the country's largest public housing authority. We've lost $2 billion in funding since 2001. And with that have the services, our buildings, half of whom are 40 years old or more, have suffered, and our residents have suffered. And so we take on this challenge of changing the way we do business so that we can deal with the larger issue of a $16 billion capital need, which is what it would cost to bring up our 2,600 buildings to a state of good repair. So the sort of three pillars of Next Gen is really changing the funding model, diversifying the funding model, and addressing some real expenses that the authority has had for 40 years or more. So we're so pleased that the mayor has baselined not only the police payments, which has been a long time rallying call from advocates and others and residents for many years, but in addition to that, the pilot payment. We are the only affordable housing owner in the city of New York that pays property taxes. And so we will no longer have to pay that going forward in the city's fiscal year 2016. And that represents, those two things right there, $102 million in real dollars back into the authority. That's more supplies, that's more people, that's more resources for the more than 500,000 people who call NYCHA home. So those are just sort of examples of how NYCHA has frankly been disinvested in
Yep.
and then there are some other very real things that we have to take on, like the Housing Authority has historically had a central office operating deficit that has been known to many for a long time. And essentially that's about $90 million. That's right off the top of our budget every year. We're going to eliminate that, and we're going to do that through a couple of ways. One is through integrating some duplicative functions with the city as a whole. And this really, I think, speaks to the mayor's goal of bringing NYCHA into the fold. Sort of gone are the days of NYCHA as this sort of island unto itself, but really bringing us into the fold and looking at ways in which not only we can improve services to residents, because that's ultimately the goal here, but also reduce costs and help us chart a path towards sustainability. So we're going to eliminate that central office cost and work very closely with the city, our labor partners, et cetera, to ensure that our employees, who are the lifeblood of the Housing Authority, and I've met many of them across the city, continue to have productive paths of employment, et cetera. So those are sort of examples of how the funding model will change. We're also going to leverage federal tools in ways that NYCHA hasn't done. Frankly, the housing authorities across the country have taken advantage of a number of different financial tools that NYCHA, frankly, is late to the party in doing, and so we're going to do that as well. And then we're also going to change our business model, right? We are going to move away from this highly centralized, you have to call 250 Broadway for every single decision that happens at the development, really taking a page from best practices from our nonprofit affordable housing developers, private sector, et cetera. Property level decision making should happen at the development, clearly within parameters, clearly with increased accountability, but ultimately to improve services to residents. The property manager knows what's best, knows how his or her building and or development should be running, understands the needs in ways that people who are 5, 6 levels above them would not. So that an effort launched January 1, and it starts with 18 developments, more than 27,000 units of housing, and we'll begin to roll that out over the portfolio over the next year or so. So a number of very specific operating issues as well, including being consistent with the mayor's goal of a more sustainable New York, in one city, one New York. NYCHA will recycle, and all of our developments will be in compliance with the city's recycling law by the end of 2016. And for us, it is clearly a given. It's the right thing for the environment. But it also goes back to those words, safe and clean. The two things that I hear so much about when I go out to developments is trash and safety. And so the ability to have a sustainable trash and waste management plan that actually separates trash, that has more bins, physical bins at the developments, is really important. It's also a safety issue for employees who work so hard to dispose of more than 190,000 tons of garbage every year. So the ability to actually have a safer waste management system will ultimately also make us a safer place to work.
I just wanted to go back to something you mentioned. You said diversifying the funding is a big key of that too. Is that to kind of to insulate yourself from the obviously like the unexpected changes in funding you might get from the federal government, which kind of happens obviously with Republicans in control there. They'd be less inclined to give additional funding for affordable housing, things like that. Also, state has been kind of fluctuated amount of how much funding they give. Is that kind of the goal there, or is it also moving in private funding and public-private partnerships going forward? Is that going to be part of the model? So
look, no business can sustain itself on one form of revenue, and ultimately the housing authority, we are an operations business, right? We have to ensure that basic operations to our residents are working. And if our core source of revenue continues to decline, and there's no indication that there's going to be a change from Washington, we have to, and it would be irresponsible for us not to look at every single tool that's at our disposal. So things like, working more closely with the city, while we are encouraged by the state's recent re-entry into public housing, that is a capital expense, not operating, a capital source, not an operating source. And we hope that the governor and the legislature will continue to focus that on buildings where we can see actual improvement in people's quality of life as opposed to other as opposed to other things. You know, we have to look at all of these tools. New York City is, you know, the leader in affordable housing and community development, and both in the production of affordable housing, but also in the preservation of affordable housing. And so it makes perfect sense that the Housing Authority would take lessons from that sector, but also look to partner with them as we preserve our buildings and contribute to the mayor's overall affordable housing plan, which we will do, as was outlined in the mayor's affordable housing plan, which they just celebrated its 1-year anniversary. NYCHA will contribute land for up to 10,000 units of affordable housing as part of the mayor's affordable housing plan. And we have done that, we have begun that process in 3 communities where, again, talking about sort of the engagement, the kind of conversation that's been different, where we recognized a couple things. One, you know, you had to meet people where they were. And so we had to partner with, we partnered with community organizing groups to work with existing resident leaders and identify new people to come to the conversation and say, not what's your vision for your building, but what's your vision for your community? And so that process has been really interesting and very dynamic. You know, we don't always agree, but if anything, if nothing else, what emerged from those conversations were some clear priorities: safety, cleanliness, and the improvement of the overall quality of life in our developments. And so if we can, by not only contributing to the mayor's affordable housing plan, recognizing whatever revenue that comes from that, and we do project some modest amount of revenue over 10 years to come back to the Housing Authority. Those revenues will be directly invested back into the issues and the priorities that were identified in those community conversations and vision conversations that we had with our residents.
Oh yeah, we're running a little bit short on time, but I have a couple more things I just wanted to bring up with you. With labor, it's obviously something that it has been criticized in the past, I guess, with just in general, like the workers at NYCHA maybe not, you know, because the union workers at NYCHA maybe not being as flexible as possible going forward and stuff like that. But I was more interested in just, I know that you have roughly 23% of NYCHA residents are employees at NYCHA. I know that the vision of NYCHA originally was to employ the people that live there to work there. Do you think that 23% is enough? Do you think there should be a higher number of NYCHA residents that are employees at NYCHA, or do you think that that's not as important as just making sure that, you know, the workforce is one that's that they can get the job done, basically?
I think the most important thing is the quality of life for our residents, right? And our employees, again, who I've had the pleasure of meeting many, most of those people come to work every day focused on doing a good job. And that is that's what inspires me to want to make sure that they have an environment to do that in. I've been very vocal about, I think we need more flexibility in order to improve the quality of life at our developments, and I look forward to working with our colleagues across the table to make that a reality for our residents.
And that kind of leads me into the just the question of obviously the public relations problems that NYCHA's had, and this is something that's, you know, developed over the course of decades. I mean, you don't get to the state we're at, you know, overnight, and clearly you're not going to fix it overnight. So what's your approach to, as you reinvest into NYCHA, what's your approach to make sure that residents know that the money's being spent well, taxpayers know that the money's being spent well, and what's your timeline, I guess, to say, like, you know, to get success, to you know, because you're not going to regain trust overnight. It's going to be over the course of time. What is your personal timeline? Like, what would you like to be? Where would you like to be at, you know, 5 years, 10 years down the road? So,
well, first of all, I think this administration and that has emphasized from the beginning that transparency and engagement and communication are not only results that we expect, but values that we really hold dear. So we've already created, made NYCHA a more transparent organization by putting information online through our NYCHA metrics, right? So all of the information around our finances, the state of our portfolio, et cetera, people can now see that, and that's updated on a regular basis. We relaunched the NYCHA Journal, a 45-year plus journal that goes out to our residents that really seeks to tell the story of NYCHA residents and really provide information to around what we are doing and to the broader community. We've updated and continue to update our social platforms, et cetera, and really trying to engage not only with our residents, but New York as a whole. I think NYCHA contributes more than $6 billion to the New York City economy every year, and so the centrality of a healthy NYCHA is the centrality is a healthy New York, and so it's important and I think imperative that New Yorkers understand and believe that NYCHA, a healthy NYCHA, is important to them. And so talking to them, engaging them, figuring out new ways in which to have those conversations is really critical. We've also, in basic things like we now stream our live stream our board meetings, and I started something called Coffees with the Chair with our employees, which is a off-the-record monthly conversation with staff up and down throughout the organization. So there are lots of different ways in which the organization needs to be more transparent. But you're absolutely right that trust doesn't come just by words; it comes by deeds. And ultimately, people want to see an improvement in their quality of life. They want to see, a decrease in the amount of time they have to wait for repairs. They want repairs to be done in a quality way. And those are the things that ultimately we'll all be judged on. And it's called Next Generation for a reason, because it's going to take a generation's worth of work in order to ensure and bring these units up to a state of good repair. But there's some interim wins that we can do. We can make developments cleaner. We can make developments safer with our partnerships with PD and residents. We can deploy our capital faster, which we have done for the last 3 years with our federal allocation. We've spent double the amount that we've typically received, and we've spent it in a third of the time. So we're making, and you'll see it by the kinds of the scaffolding that's all around the city that's coming down, right? Not just the scaffolding that goes up never to be taken down again. We've removed some 6 miles of legacy shedding across the city, where residents would rightfully complained that there was no work going on. Why was scaffolding going on? So we've really changed our policy to only have scaffolding where we have active construction projects going on. We've installed the cameras. We've fixed the doors. There's a lot more that we need to do. We also need our residents to partner with us, right? To also recognize that those investments are investments, and they have to be protected and they have to be respected. And so, the new way of engaging with residents is something that is also core to Next Gen, which is around a more sustainable resident engagement model. We have 328 developments and only 200 functioning tenant associations. So there's more than a third of NYCHA residents aren't represented in any form or fashion. So a key part of Next Gen will be really changing that dynamic and really seeking to bring more people into the conversation about the future of the Housing Authority.
NYCHA Chair and CEO Shola Olatoye, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure.
Great.